So tonight in the Crisis, Loss, and Trauma Counseling, we're in session 4, and tonight we want to talk about PTD, also known as ASD, PTSD, and CPTSD, and we're going to define these terms. PTD, post-traumatic distress, and ASD, acute stress disorder, that's what the world calls it. This is the ongoing or recurring, interrelated, interwoven emotional and mental reactions to the stress of a traumatic event in a person's life. This will often cause corresponding physical stress responses to develop as well. Now, PTD, post-trauma distress, is how our counseling ministry has chosen to define all categories of what the world has labeled PTSD and CPTSD. Okay. Now, it is important to keep in mind that as human beings, we are synergistic wholes, right? We are mind, we are body, we are soul, okay? So what impacts one part of us impacts the rest of us. So we talk about how what impacts the mind impacts the soul, impacts the body. Because remember in the Psalms, David says, I'm exhausted as I groan. All night long I drench my bed in tears. My tears saturate the cushions beneath me. And then he says, I am poured out like water. My strength fails me because of my sin, and my bones become brittle. I am depressed. I cannot eat. I weep day and night. So we see there's emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical dynamics to the aftermath of trauma. Then what the world calls PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or trauma 1. PTSD is the label they use to quantify a spectrum of after reactions to trauma, usually denoting long-term intense and trigger reactions to the said past event or situation, usually after the period of 3 months. Okay, first 3 months, they'll call it ASD or PTD. A lot of people in the biblical counseling world are calling it post-trauma stress. I think that's inaccurate. It needs to be post-trauma distress. Stress sounds like something more physical than mental emotional, and distress is mental emotional with physical components. And then there's CPTSD, complex PTSD, or trauma 2. This CPTSD develops as a result of either long-term, sustained, or repeated traumas, or multiple trauma events that combine and compound, often with a complexity of differing yet entangled triggers. So you've got somebody who has long-term abuse, kidnapped survivor, prisoner of war, okay? That's complex PTSD. But then you have someone who's abused as a child, they lose their home to a tornado, they end up being serving in a combat unit. So they've got multiple trauma events over time, and those combine. Now, I was actually diagnosed with CPTSD before it was actually a thing. They didn't know what to call it. But one of the things that's most important for us to remember is that these things that are happening to the brain and the body, the mind and the emotions, is not a disorder. It's a malfunction. And as we've talked about before, and I'm going to talk about more this evening, is that this is survival. This is how God wired us and made us to survive. The thing is that we're not in that survival situation, but it feels like we are. And so the brain, the body, the emotions all act as if we're in that trauma event, even though we're not. So the system is malfunctioning. It's not a disorder, it's a malfunction. Well, malfunctions can be repaired, can't they? Sure. But if it's a disorder, you're kind of stuck, aren't you? Right? So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of PTSD or PTD. There are recent developments in brain imaging that have allowed scientists to study the brains of patients afflicted with a variety of disorders. Identifying the parts of the brain that are involved in these disorders is the key to understanding how the disorders arise and are maintained. Okay, So brain imaging studies of PTSD have identified a few key brain regions whose function appears to be altered in PTSD, most notably the amygdala, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus. So we're going to talk about these as we go. But the amygdala is an almond-shaped region, and the word amygdala is Greek for almond. And it's a key to the normal expression of emotions, especially fear. And brain imaging studies see very high activity in the amygdala when the subjects experience anxiety, stress, or phobias, fears, right? So you take a look at the picture that we have, and you've got a normal brain, and then you've got the PTSD brain. And you can see in the middle how the difference in the shape. And if you notice, you've got that thing that looks like a bird flying, and underneath it, it looks almost like the bird pooped. Well, if you look on the PTSD brain, that little dark spot is almost invisible. That's where the amygdala is. Now, we talked the VMPFC prefrontal cortex is thinking of the higher or more sophisticated part of the brain. And that is involved in less well-defined activities such as emotional processing and decision-making. This is where rationality and reason operate out of. And then the hippocampus is a large region, and that's that thing in the middle that looks like the bird flying. Very simply, it's involved in memory, especially spatial memory. So a very generalized model of what happens during normal responses to stress and anxiety is this. A person encounters some kind of environmental cue that signals danger. For example, they see a tiger, right? So that information is sent to the amygdala, which identifies and sorts that information, right? And it sends out a fight or flight response to the other parts of the brain, the hippocampus, right? So the prefrontal cortex tells the amygdala, it's okay. The tiger's in a cage. You know what a cage is. The tiger can't escape the cage. It's okay. You can calm down. But another part of the brain, the hippocampus, helps out, providing information about the context of the event. We're at a zoo. We know what a zoo is like. We've seen them before. So this is the brain functioning well with itself, and the mind responding to the mind, the prefrontal cortex, and the regions of the organic parts of the brain working well together. Okay. So the prefrontal cortex inhibits the amygdala to keep it from letting the fear responses go unchecked. Now, brain imaging studies of PTSD sufferers generally show two things: reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex and increased activity in the amygdala. So the energy levels are completely out of balance. So one long-held interpretation of these studies is that in PTSD, the prefrontal cortex is like asleep at the wheel, which allows the amygdala to go unchecked and thus produce many of the intense anxiety symptoms that are a key feature of what is called PTSD. Now, we hold that this is not just an organic problem, obviously. This is rooted in the thinking, the beliefs, and the emotions that are all involved in all of this, the inorganic aspect of who we are. But let's talk about some signs and symptoms. Okay? Unresolved trauma can have a variety of effects. These can be grouped into three basic categories. One is the re-experiencing symptoms. We've talked about this a little bit before. This is the flashbacks, the reliving the trauma over and over as if it's happening right now, even though it's in the past, including physical symptoms like heart racing or sweating. And what's interesting is a lot of times people, they have, they'll feel their chest tighten, they'll feel themselves take a deep breath, they'll feel their eyes widen, they'll feel their legs tense, like they're going to get up and run. or they'll feel their fists clench. Usually the body will respond. And if we can get them to pay attention to what's happening with their body and recognize that this is like an early warning system of what is about to happen, they can actually learn to take control of that and get their thinking back into the reality of the moment. Now, re-experiencing symptoms can cause problems in a person's everyday life and routine. It can start just with the thoughts and feelings that they have, but words, objects, or situations that are reminders of the traumatic event can also trigger the re-experiencing. Something as seemingly innocuous as a smell. But smell is one of the most powerful triggers, smell and sound, but smell especially. I used to get angry every time I smelled Old Spice and did not know why. I hated it. I hated anybody who wore it. Well, years later, after I remembered and started working through my sexual abuse, my first offender wore Old Spice. And I didn't even put that together until my mother mentioned that. I just find it odd that you hate Old Spice so much. I thought you loved it because your grandpa used to wear that. And I suddenly put two and two together. That's why I hate Old Spice. Then we have avoidance symptoms. And people can live in this place of avoidance in some pretty sophisticated systems they develop to avoid. So first is staying away from places, events, or objects that are reminders of the experience. And you'll hear people say, oh, I never go there. I never eat this. I never, right? They're going to do everything they can to avoid this thing that it serves as a significant reminder or trigger. Feeling emotionally numb, just shutting the emotions off. If I don't have, and we've talked before that emotions are like a microwave. They're on or they're off. Say, I don't want to feel this. We're saying, I don't want to feel. Because emotions are ganged together. We dial one down, they're all dialed down. Okay. And I talked too about, I had basically two emotions, angry and very angry. Well, anger itself is not an emotion. Okay. It's what's underneath anger that really are the emotion. But anger is a way to actually protect yourself from the fear, the pain, the fear of pain or the fear of loss. There's a feeling of strong guilt, depression, worry, anxiety. Running through life like Piglet. They're just anxious all the time, nervous, or very depressed, or guilt and toxic shame. Losing interest in activities that were enjoyable in the past. I was talking to someone earlier today, and when he was a freshman in high school, he was a starter with a varsity basketball team. Loved basketball, but he also enjoyed doing 4-H, right? Well, jocks don't do 4-H. And so the other people on the team and the people who, they gave him such a bad time, they got to the place where he loved playing basketball, but he hated, but he was captain of the team. So it was how he was socially accepted in the school, in the group. And he said by his senior year, he sat and ate lunch alone because he was so concerned about hiding who he really was. That rejection that he felt from his peer group as a freshman over that was so traumatic that it completely changed the trajectory of his life. We might not think that's a big deal, but he completely lost interest in the things that he used to love. And then having trouble remembering even the dangerous event. I know it was a big deal, but it's like this blank spot. We talked about dissociation. That's another factor that causes that. So things that remind a person of the traumatic event can trigger avoidance symptoms. And these symptoms can cause a person to change their personal routine. So like after a bad car accident, a person who usually drives may avoid driving or riding in a car altogether. Someone who was attacked by a dog, hates dogs, can't stand dogs, will do whatever they have to avoid walking anywhere near a dog, even though that there's no real threat anymore. So they're going to avoid any reminder of the traumatic event. And the third is what we call hyperarousal symptoms. This is like always being on guard, always being on edge, on the alert. Okay, so there's what we call a startle response, a loud noise or something like that. They'll startle. They're just really jerk. Just feeling tense and agitated, on edge all the time. Having difficulty sleeping, going to sleep or staying asleep, and or having angry outbursts. Just all of a sudden, they're just over the top. Okay, so hyperarousal symptoms are usually constant instead of being triggered by things that remind a person of the traumatic event. They live in that state, always on guard, always ready. And that wears on them, and they can eventually feel extremely stressed and angry all the time. Okay, that's where I lived. And these hyperarousal symptoms can make it hard to do just everyday basic things, like sleeping, eating, concentrating, carrying on a conversation, remembering what you were saying 5 minutes ago. And memory problems also play a large part in PTSD or PTD. PTSD patients report deficits in declarative memory, that's remembering facts or lists, fragmentation of memory and dissociative amnesia, gaps in memory lasting from minutes to days that are not caused by ordinary forgetting. I have years that are just empty, just big gaps, big holes that are just not there. I have no idea where I lived. The only reason I have any idea where I lived at all was because my family had mentioned things, but I have no pictures in my head at all. I've seen family pictures, sitting on a front porch. I have no idea what house that is. I have no idea what city that house is in. I don't know who lived there. I have one picture of a bunch of the cousins together. They said, well, that's your front porch. Where? Well, I don't remember the house at all. Let's talk a little bit about symptoms that are associated with childhood abuse. Because the way it impacts children is different, because children relate to their world differently than adults do. Okay. One is nightmares. Another is flashbacks, memory or concentration problems, hyperarousal, hypervigilance, intrusive memories. This is where just out of nowhere they remember something and it can be terrifying. Avoidance, as we talked about, abnormal startle responses, and feeling worse when reminded of the trauma. They internalize it and they personalize it. They take it hard, like it's their fault. It's their fault that this happened. They should have done something to stop it. They should have done something to change it. So they take on a toxic shame responsibility. Then we have what was called dissociative. This is like the out-of-body experience. You're an observer watching what's happening. You're not in it experiencing it. And I don't know about you, but I have lots of memories from my childhood that are like that. That I'm an observer. And I'm not really engaged in it. So is it actually a memory or not? Then there's what we call derealization. This is where we just disconnect from reality and from the reality of who we are. Disconnect. See, so there's a difference between dissociation and disassociation. Dissociation has to do with memory of events. Disassociation has to do with connection with yourself. There's amnesia, which we talked about, just forgetting, and then fragmented sense of self and identity. Have bits and pieces, but you'll often hear them say, I really don't know who I am. I don't know who I really am. I don't know. Well, what do you want to be when you grow up? I don't know. They just have no real sense of themselves or anything. There's anxiety, of course. Panic attacks. Claustrophobia is an interesting one. When somebody starts talking about being claustrophobic, I wonder about childhood trauma. Okay? Because claustrophobia is an intense sense of powerlessness and inability to escape. That's very correlative to trauma. And then another thing we see is substance abuse, alcohol and drugs, of course. But even other things, behavioral things, gambling, pornography, shopping, eating, those kinds of things. Let's look a little bit at behavior problems. Many abuse victims report that they remember seemingly random or minor details of the abuse event while forgetting central events. They remember the color of a blanket, or they remember a lamp on a table, or they'll remember what they got for that birthday. Okay, but the central details of the trauma event, they will forget. There was one woman who'd been locked in a closet, had an isolated memory of the smell of old clothes and the sound of a clock ticking. Later, she connected these with details with feelings of intense fear. Only then was she able to recall the whole picture of what had happened to her. She didn't have her own room. She didn't have her own closet. Or her own dresser. She didn't have her own bed. She slept on a pallet on the floor in the closet, and they locked the door. They locked the door and kept her in there. They would bring her out to do chores, and she never got to eat the food that the rest of the family ate. Just absolutely horrible. She was like, she was like a child who'd been kidnapped from another family. Childhood abuse and other sources of extreme stress can have lasting effects on the parts of the brain that are involved in memory and emotion. The hippocampus in particular seems to be very sensitive to stress. Damage to the hippocampus from stress can not only cause problems in dealing with memories and other effects of past stressful events, it can also impair new learning, because the hippocampus's job is to take information in, sort it, categorize it, sort it, and then file it away where it goes. But when it's been stressed, especially when it's been inundated with too many hormones, we'll talk about this when we look at sexual assault survivors. We'll talk about this more. But the hippocampus can't do that. It can't do the sorting because it's busy sorting, trying to interpret other things. Damage to the hippocampus following exposure to the stress brought on by childhood abuse leads to distortion and fragmentation of memories. Besides the hippocampus, abnormalities of other brain areas, including the medial prefrontal cortex, are also associated with PTSD. Dysfunction in these medial prefrontal cortex regions may underlie pathological emotional responses in patients with PTSD. So we see a failure of being able to calm fear responses, right? In other words, a rape victim who is raped in a dark alley will have fearful reactions to dark places for years after the original event, even though there's no threat associated with any particular dark place. Okay. And PTSD can also cause problems with non-declarative memory. So this is the non-conscious motor memory, like remembering how to ride a bicycle, which again, this shows extreme trauma response. And it can show up as abnormal condition responses and the reliving of traumatic experience when something happens to remind the sufferer of past abuse. And these types of memory disturbances can be related to physical changes in the hippocampus and medial prefrontal cortex. Those regions of the brain are not processing information the way God designed them to, because they've been damaged. Okay. Now, it's natural to have some of these symptoms following a dangerous traumatic event. And sometimes people have very serious symptoms, but they go away after a few weeks. This is often what is called acute stress disorder, okay, or acute stress response. But when the symptoms last more than a few weeks and become an ongoing problem and even grow, that's when it's often categorized as PTSD. What's interesting, though, is sometimes people won't even have any symptoms show up for weeks or even months. They manage to cope with it for a while, and then suddenly the realization of what they experienced sets in. So non-survivors, especially of significant childhood trauma like abuse, have a hard time understanding why the survivor just can't seem to get over it and get past it. Well, part of the reason is because there have been permanent changes to the brain itself, and the brain's ability to process the information the way God intended has been handicapped. So those who counsel survivors of childhood sexual abuse often talk about how the abuse rewired that child. Regions of the brain and areas of the brain have been activated, and emotions and things have been brought online too early, before the brain and the body are able to handle those things. Like in Song of Solomon, right? Be careful not to awaken passion before the right time. Okay, that's why the sexualization of children is so damaging, because a child is not able to handle the thoughts, the emotions, or even the physical sensations that go with all of that. Traumatic stress, like that caused by childhood sexual abuse, can have far-reaching effects on the brain and how it functions, but also on the emotions and the mind, how a person relates to life. Recent studies indicate that extreme stress can cause measurable physical changes, again, in the hippocampus and the medial prefrontal cortex. These changes, in turn, lead not only to what is classically known as PTSD, but can also result in such a loss and distortion of memory of the events surrounding the abuse that it creates ongoing problems with their ability to learn and to just remember new information. I don't understand why you can't get it. It's not that complicated. Well, it may not be, but the brain is not processing the information the way a healthy brain would. So these findings help explain some of the controversial phenomenon of recovered, delayed, or intrusive memory. They just can't remember, and they can't hold on to new things. So do children react differently than adults? Children and teens can have extreme reactions to trauma, but their symptoms may not be the same as adults. In very young children, these symptoms can include bedwetting. After they've learned how to use the toilet before, they haven't wet the bed, and all of a sudden they start bedwetting. They'll regress and they'll go back to baby talk or not be able to communicate verbally very well. Their play starts to include the traumatic event, the scary event that they experienced, because that's how children learn and process their life, is through play, by reenactment. And they can become unusually clingy to someone close to them. They don't want to be separated. That fear of separation makes them feel overly vulnerable to more trauma. And older children and teens usually show symptoms more like those in adults, but they also have a tendency to develop disruptive, disrespectful, even destructive behaviors. And older children and teens may feel guilty for not preventing injury or death or the abuse that they suffered. And they may also have long-lasting thoughts of extreme vengeance. We also see cutting come in. I've counseled many, many, many cutters. And all the ones that I've counseled have experienced significant abuse. The majority of them sexual abuse. So what you have is you have a 13, 14-year-old girl who ends up being fondled, molested, and her body responds the way God designed it to respond to that kind of stimulation. Well, her body has betrayed her, so she's going to punish her body. But there's also the pain of the shame that won't go away. She doesn't know how to deal with it. And so if she cuts herself, okay, that pain makes sense. And that pain is more intense than the internal pain that she's experiencing as a result. So for a while, she's able to manage that internal pain. And it's easy to imagine then that, okay, as the blood is coming out, so is the pain. The pain is leaking out as well. Okay. So it's trying to manage and deal with that pain that they can't even make sense of because they feel responsible for it somehow. Anyway, I think that's a good place to take a break. Okay. Any thoughts or questions on what we covered so far? One of the reasons it's important for us to talk about these things from the broader perspective of just what's going on mentally and emotionally is because we've talked before in other contexts about as synergistic wholes, our brain is the organ, the brain, the organism is involved in this. And it's been damaged and it's unhealthy in some ways. But yet we know that the brain actually can heal itself. And so understanding that while the brain has been damaged and can handicap dealing with these situations, these circumstances in healthy ways sometimes, it's healable, it's addressable. So that's why we want to move away from the language of disorder and understand that this is a malfunction that actually can be repaired. So who's at risk? Who can get this? Well, we need to understand that PTSD can occur at any age, including childhood. Now, women are more likely to develop PTSD than men, and there's some evidence that susceptibility to PTSD may run in families. But more and more researchers are believing that that's because people who have survived trauma don't deal with life and relationships in healthy ways, and they can actually traumatize those around them without intending to. So it's not that it's a genetic factor, it's actually an interrelational factor. Anyone can get PTSD at any age. It doesn't matter whether they're war veterans, survivors of physical, sexual assault, abuse, accidents, disasters, any other extremely serious event. And remember, it's very subjective. What's serious for one person may not be serious for another. And now, not everyone with PTSD has been through a dangerous event. Some people get PTSD after a friend or family member experiences danger or is harmed. The sudden, unexpected death of a loved one can also cause post-trauma distress. This has to do with how a person deals with what's happening and its after effect. So why do some people get it and others not? It's important to remember that not everyone who lives through a dangerous event gets PTSD. In fact, most who go through dangerous events won't suffer from it. There are a lot of factors that play a part in whether a person will get post-trauma distress. And some of these factors that make a person more likely to get it, there are some factors that make more likely a person will get it. But then there's other factors called resilience factors that reduce the risk. And some of these risk and resilient factors are present before the trauma. Others become important during and after the traumatic event. So let's talk about some of the risk factors. First, of course, is living through dangerous events and traumas. And of course, the more dangerous and the more traumatic, the more often this happens, the greater the number of incidents, the greater the risk. Having a history of what is called mental illness. So there are other things going on. They've struggled with what the world calls depression or anxiety or other things. Actually getting hurt, suffering harm as a result of the dangerous event. That increases the risk factor. Seeing people hurt or killed. And one of the things that's hard for people to understand is that witnessing someone go through being harmed or killed can be just as traumatic to a person, or even abuse can be just as traumatic to the person witnessing as the person who's experiencing it. Okay? It's actually a greater sense of powerlessness to someone who witnesses it, because they feel like, well, it wasn't happening to me. I should have been able to do something, or I wasn't able to do something, which can be traumatic. Feeling horror at what's happening, like the Twin Towers coming down, a sense of helplessness. A sense of helplessness, or an extreme amount of fear. Okay, and then having little or no social support after the event. So that means that they feel completely alone, abandoned. And then dealing with extra stress after the event. So not just going through the hurricane, but lost a loved one, pain, injury, loss of job, loss of home. So not just the stress of the event, but then some kind of loss that went with it. Resilience factors that may reduce the risk of post-trauma distress is seeking out support from other people, such as family and friends. So in other words, not trying to handle it on your own. Finding a support group after a traumatic event. That was one of the things that they did in New York for police officers, for law enforcement. They provided them opportunities to debrief. It was actually mandatory. Feeling good about your reactions in the face of danger. I handled that really well. Instead of completely losing my mind or freaking out or running off and abandoning, my child to the bear, I risked being eaten by the bear myself and swooped in and saved the child. Having a coping strategy or a way of getting better as you go through the event, and then learning from it. I know that God's going to use this some way, somehow. I'm not sure how. I don't understand, but I'm sure God is going to use it somehow. And being able to act and respond effectively despite feeling fear. You find this a lot of times with people who've been in combat. They're terrified, but everything comes together. The training takes over and they respond appropriately, and they actually help. Instead of losing the entire platoon, everybody survives, or just with a few wounded. Do you guys have the handout, Post-Traumatic Distress by Paul Randolph? Do you have that in your stuff? I think you do. Did you guys read that already? Yes, no? Right, so let me read from this handout that you were supposed to get that some way, somehow I failed to. He's got several vignettes, Paul Randolph, and he's got several vignettes he mentions. A couple heads home after the vacation and a drunk driver slams into their car. They find themselves in a hospital intensive care unit with life-threatening injuries. A family receives the news that their son was killed in action in Baghdad. A family evacuates their home before Hurricane Katrina strikes. They eventually return to find that their home has been totally destroyed. A firefighter pulls a child from a bedroom in flames, but moments too late. The child has already succumbed to smoke inhalation. A suicidal gunman invades a small Amish school and kills a number of young girls. An angry and frustrated Virginia Tech student guns down 32 innocent people in a murderous rampage. Tragic events such as these cause great stress for those directly involved as well as for those closely connected to the situation. Each event may precipitate a variety of physical, mental, emotional, behavioral, or spiritual responses. Each may lead to chaotic and debilitating responses that leave family and friends concerned and confused for varying periods of time. Human beings respond to these extreme losses, sufferings, threats, and evils in similar ways. Psychologists label these responses post-traumatic stress syndrome. They now call it a disorder, but it was a syndrome. It used to be a syndrome. As Christians, we may not always know how to handle people's reactions to traumatic events. When we face an emergency situation, we often respond from a secular model or viewpoint. Perhaps we even think the chance of having to deal with a major traumatic event is so remote that we wonder, why should I even bother to think about how I should respond? But Columbine, Oklahoma City, 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, and the Lancaster County Amish Schoolhouse Virginia Tech shootings demonstrate that traumatic events can happen anywhere, anytime. Think about what happened in Las Vegas. This is a quote from Randolph, during my 20 plus years as a pastor, I have served as a chaplain for the Philadelphia Police Department and for 2 volunteer fire companies. I've worked with police officers, firefighters, and their families in the midst of extremely difficult and stressful situations. I also serve on a county critical incident response team. If these experiences have taught me anything, it is that God cares about people who experience traumatic events. As biblical counselors and friends, we're called to minister to those who face significant life-changing events. Maybe you have a friend or loved one who is dealing with a traumatic event and its aftermath. Or maybe you faced a traumatic event yourself. The material you read here will give you some insight into how to help them face their difficulties. So post-traumatic distress. We've talked about this before. It's been estimated that over 80% of Americans will be exposed to some traumatic event in their lifetime. About 10% of that number will develop the more extreme version of distress reaction, commonly labeled PTSD. Between 10 and 15% of police officers and 10 to 30% of firefighters have such extreme reactions in response to situations in their work. The VA found that 16% of Vietnam veterans experienced PTSD. The U.S. Center for Mental Health Services estimated that 1.5 million New York City residents sought counseling for terrorism-related complaints as a result of 9/11. A 2001 study by Wee and Myers suggests that over 50% of disaster relief workers would be expected to develop significant post-traumatic distress. Following the sarin gas attack in Tokyo, far more residents suffered psychological symptoms than were physically impacted by the incident. We're going to talk a lot more about this later, but trauma care experts describe 10 categories of events, the terrible 10, as particularly difficult for people to handle. Death or suicide of a family member, friend, or colleague. Death at workplace in military and emergency services is called a line of duty death. Serious workplace or line of duty injury. Disaster or multi-casualty incident. Police shooting, accidental killing or wounding of an innocent person, events with extreme threat to participants, significant events involving harm or potential harm to children, prolonged experiences of suffering, especially involving a loss, events in which victims are relatives, events with excessive media interest, and any other significant event capable of causing considerable emotional distress to anyone exposed to it. Typical reactions to traumatic events can be divided into 5 categories: physical symptoms, altered thinking patterns, emotional reactions, behavioral changes, and spiritual struggles. We've talked about a lot of those, but let's talk about some basic things on how do we minister to those suffering from distress. The first thing is we have to be caring and attentive and present. So be a good listener, right? One of the best ways to be helpful to somebody after a traumatic event or disaster is to provide a listening ear and allow the person to share what happened and how they're feeling. The more they're able to debrief, if you will, on what they experienced, and the closer to the incident they're able to do that, the less impact that incident is going to have in the long run. We call it debriefing. The first 48 hours are the most critical. So giving a person an opportunity to talk through it as soon after the event as possible is the most important thing. And it's really important, don't say, I know how you feel, it could have been worse, you have so much to be grateful for, okay? God works all things together for good, you know, those kinds of things. In the moment, what the person needs to know is that somebody sitting there cares. So you need to listen, and then you need to listen, and then you need to listen. Okay, silence is not your enemy. And pay attention. Are they having a difficult time functioning? Ask them what they need. You can have someone die. A woman loses her husband in a car accident when he's on his way home from work. She may not be able to feed the children, clean the house, cook a meal. She may not be able to do laundry. She may not even be able to get herself dressed. Okay. She's not sinning, and there's nothing wrong with her. She's dealing with the after effects of extreme distress. Okay. So we have to be gently helpful, gently directive. Say, okay, so how are you doing on day-to-day responsibilities? How are you doing on keeping the house up, or how are you doing on keeping you guys fed? So well, let's get this handled, okay? What kind of meals is your family used to eating? Okay, so get some very practical help, but listen to them. Don't fix them, because they may have a really difficult time just making decisions about simple things. So you can help them regain a sense of control by having them make daily decisions. What time would you like for dinner to be ready for your family? Okay, that gives them some sense of control. You also need to encourage them to take care of their physical needs. Do they need a shower? Do they need to eat? Do they need to get some rest? Do they need to go for a walk? Encourage them to journal. Just, encourage them to talk to you if they feel the need to just talk it out and be willing to listen. And then pay attention to things that don't seem to change, like the after effects of trauma seem to persist. The triggers can last for a really, really long time in a person's life. There's an example that he uses from the Titanic. He says that some people, an event can be so severe that 1 or 2 triggers may linger throughout the person's life. One of the survivors of the Titanic disaster eventually settled in Chicago near Wrigley Field, where the Chicago Cubs play baseball. During the sinking of the Titanic, he'd been able to get into a lifeboat but he felt a lot of guilt about being a survivor when so many had died. One of the most disturbing aspects of that fateful night was hearing the screams for help from so many hundreds of people floundering in the water. Those already in his lifeboat refused to row back and pick up any more people. Throughout his life, any time the Cubs hit a home run and the crowd roared, he would have a flashback to his experience in that lifeboat. The sound of the crowd cheering for the home run reminded him of the people screaming for help in the icy Atlantic Ocean. And then people who have been in combat are often back in a combat environment when they hear explosions, a backfire of a car, different sounds like that. 4th of July, you have these things that do this whistling sound. You know, it sounds like incoming artillery, incoming mortar. Absolutely terrifying to somebody who's been under fire. There's nothing fun about those things. So again, you've got this trigger that there's the threat, the real threat is gone, but the reminders of the threat are still very present. We have to remember that 1 Thessalonians 5:14, are we dealing with somebody who's being rebellious? Are we dealing with somebody who's weak, faint-hearted, timid? What's going on with them? Okay, we have to know that a victim of a traumatic event, even though they're still a sinner, there's going to be a weakness that they are suffering from that doesn't have anything to do with rebellion. So it's important not to treat them as a rebellious sinner in this moment, but somebody who is dealing with the after effects of something that was disastrous, traumatic for them. One of the hardest things to remember is that we have to minister to the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. Okay. Now, we could get into this a lot more, but what I'll do is I'll email the handout to you and you can look through it. Matter of fact, I will write myself a note and remember to do that. It'll be helpful to you. A lot of it will sound familiar because we do talk about this a lot. One of the primary foci of the ministry that we do at Truth and Love is with trauma survivors. One more thing I want to look at, and that's the picture in your study guide of how stress changes a child's brain. If you take a look at the picture, you see a normal picture of a normal brain. Okay. On the right-hand side, you see this is for a 3-year-old child. You can see the difference in the two pictures. The one on the right, this child has suffered extreme neglect. Okay. Now we're going to talk about this in greater detail in the next module, Counseling Survivors of Abuse. But prolonged exposure to trauma triggers physiological changes in the brain. Take a look at the center part of the brain around where the hippocampus is. Look at how it's dark. Okay, that's where emotions are regulated from. So a child that's under extreme neglect, they don't learn to regulate their emotions. Okay, so constant stress, whether it's neglect, abandonment, abuse. So the brain's memory and emotional center are damaged and they don't function well. You can see how the brain has shrunken, and that creates more problems with memory, learning, and even behavior, the ability to make sense of life and make good decisions. Okay? And as a result of this, they're at far greater risk of more emotional problems as they grow older, other behavioral problems, and even getting into drug and alcohol abuse and other things like that, trying to cope with the pain, trying to get some sense of balance and control in their life. But all they do is produce a life that's more out of control, which moves them in the wrong direction. And they feel trapped. Anyway, so that's just the overview of post-trauma distress. Any thoughts or questions or anything on what we covered this evening?